Hello, my random viewers, and welcome to Randomly Offensive. Today, we are going to be talking about King from the Tekken franchise and covering his story, because he is an incredibly iconic character, not just in the Tekken franchise, but in arcade fighting games as a whole. He is one of the most iconic characters to be on the screen. And people love King. He is incredibly iconic. He has a huge fan base, and the reason for that is because people love tragic heroes, and that's exactly what King is a tragic hero. He has an incredibly tragic backstory, and he has a very sad, tragic story through Tekken 1 and 2, because the King I am covering today only debuts in the first two Tekkens, because the King for the rest of the games is not the same King that we saw in the first game. However, the King that I am covering today is the one that created the iconic vision of King because of his tragedy and because of the kind of man that he is. He makes you the kind of man that you want to be, and he makes you the kind of person that you want to strive to become, and everything he goes through makes you makes your heart break because of the fact that you don't ever want to have to experience what this man experiences, and you never want to go through that. He's no longer just a cool character in the Tekken franchise. He goes away from the Heihachi, Kazuha, Jin storylines of just cool, epic stories of unbelievable power, and he also goes away from the fun stories of Paul, Martial Law, and Forest Law, where they're mostly just goofing around and they're living everyday life. King is a tragic hero, and because of that, he is just an incredible person to delve into and an incredible person to talk about. So with that all being said, let's dive into it. Our story begins with a young boy who has no parents, no family, and has been alone for as long as he can remember. And the only joy that he finds is every Sunday getting to turn on the TV at the orphanage that he lives at and watch the Armored King, a great famous luchador, wrestling and fighting and dominating. And this young boy admires just the fact and the pure strength and persistence that this Armored King shows, and this little boy becomes a huge fan of Armored King. Now, this boy ends up growing up and starts delving into the art of professional wrestling and aspires to become a luchador. Now, he ends up being taken in by a very friendly family, and he ends up being taken care of by this family and finally gets to know love and finally gets to know what it feels like to have a family. And then finally, when he decides to achieve his dream and pursue his dream of being a famous luchador and being a pro wrestler, he ends up being disowned by his family, because it is not a dream nor a career that is honorable, and it is not a career that he should be following. And so, by following his dream that he's had ever since a kid and trying to live up to an icon that got him through the tough times, is the very thing that caused him to lose what he's always wanted, which was a family. And so he ends up taking the name of King, and he ends up donning the Jaguar mask, and he is a very loving man, and he founds an orphanage, and he's running an orphanage and taking care of all these kids. However, he's just not making enough money, being the wrestler that he is, to take care of this orphanage and the amount of kids that he's taking. And so that is when he decides to go ahead and join the Iron Fist tournament. Now, the Armored King that we mentioned is not canon in the first game, and he's not in the first game. Also, the Armored King that King looked up to as a kid is not going to be the same Armored King throughout the franchise. And when he becomes a luchador, Armored King is passed down to another person. The title of Armored King is passed down, and they end up becoming rivals throughout his history. And he has fought this Armored King multiple times, and these two have created a rivalry, but also a friendship. However, Armored King does not compete in the first Iron Fist tournament. So King is going in there, and he's needing to make money. He's hoping to settle for the cash prize, winning the tournament, in order to take care of all these orphans that he has taken in and has promised to protect and feed and shelter. So upon being accepted into the Iron Fist tournament, King says goodbye to his orphanage and his orphans and tells them that he will be back, and he will be back with what he needs to feed them and shelter them. And so with that, King takes off and heads to the first Iron Fist tournament. So the first Iron Fist tournament is held in a forest area, and King's first opponent is Jack. Now, Jack is the strongest character all the way up until Tekken 3, because he's mostly robotic. He's an android type character, and Jack starts the fight off by tearing a tree out of the ground and swinging it down as if it was a sword or a samurai directly towards King. And that is when King is able to show his immense strength, because he catches the damn tree that was swung with immense might directly towards him, and he catches the tree above his head and is holding this tree up as Jack is pressing it down, trying to crush King. And so King does start getting tired, his muscles start wearing, and so he steps to the right and throws the tree to the right, and the tree slams into the ground, causing a huge cloud of dirt to arise into the air, and King launches through the dirt cloud and engages into hand-to-hand combat with Jack. Now, every punch that King throws causes a dent in the metal parts of Jack's torso, and same with Jack's face. Not only that, but the speed of King's strikes are far faster than anything that Jack is capable of throwing, due to Jack's just pure mass and body style, right? And so King is just sending this onslaught of attacks at a high speed and a high strength volume, because King cannot get punched by Jack, at least as far as he's concerned. He does not want to get hit by this guy because he just tore a tree out of the fucking ground. You don't want to be hit by a man that is capable of that kind of feat. So King is dancing around this guy and going from strikes to grapples to strikes to grapples. He will grapple Jack's left arm and just crank it right behind Jack and put him in an arm lock while delivering open palm strikes and elbows to the back of Jack's head. And when Jack manages to get free of said grapple, then King just continues with offensive strikes and maneuvers. And as King overwhelms Jack, Jack is deciding that he needs to win this fight, right? So he gets in this sitting type form and starts kicking his legs out while in the sitting stance, and is just delivering massive kicks to King's left leg, just repeatedly, one after another, and trying to knock King down. But King is not falling down. He's just receiving these kicks to the knee, and that will cause damage in the future of his fights going on. However, for now, it seems like he's doing just fine. And now Jack finally stands up and delivers a massive punch that connects in between King's rib cages, just throwing King backwards and knocking the air out of King. But King doesn't care. He gets back up, even though he just lost his breath and had the breath knocked out of him, and just flies right back to Jack, and he continues the onslaught that he was once delivering, combining grapples with strikes and just dancing in circles around this massive robotic force to be reckoned with, Jack. But when Jack starts throwing attacks, King has no choice but just to put his arms up, and defend himself and protect himself for his life, because every punch that connects to the forearm or the bicep of King as he blocks these massive attacks sends shockwaves through the valley, through the forest. It's shaking trees, it's causing the grass to move. And so whenever Jack starts throwing these onslaughts of punches, King is just held defenseless as he holds his arms up, protecting his face and his torso. Now, the worst part about this fight is anytime King tries to do a stranglehold, it doesn't affect Jack, because Jack doesn't need oxygen. That also means that Jack is never going to get tired. So King starts having the odds stack against him very quickly throughout this fight, and he's getting to a point where he is not going to be able to continue doing this forever, where Jack can do this for hundreds of years. I mean, because he just has nothing to lose. He doesn't have any energy to lose. He doesn't have any oxygen to lose. And honestly, Jack was set up to be one of the most powerful fighters in the Tekken franchise. It was only because of his lack of fandom that never happened. So, King, in this fight, decides to pick up this 1,000-pound boulder. And he picks this fucking thing up. And of course, his legs are shaking, his arms are trembling, and he has this thing up, and Jack is going to punch him right in the stomach and cause this boulder to fall on top of him. And that is when King throws this boulder, and just at a massive speed, and it's causing the grass on the ground to actually be moved due to the pure pressure and speed and force that this boulder was thrown at. And it hits Jack and sends Jack flying right into the side of a mountain. And when the boulder finally lets loose, that's when you see Jack's, basically his software giving out, and he finally shuts down. And so King manages to take the win. However, he's damaged. It's almost the exact same story as Heihachi. He has hardly any energy left. He just used up a lot of his strength, and his left kneecap is just not looking good. And with his second match on the way, he is looking at martial law, a master martial artist, and with the amount of pain and lack of energy that King just put forth, he's gonna need a break. And luckily, it's given to him. Whether you agree with this next move or not, the break that King needed has been given to him, because martial law has been watching King on the telly because of him being a famous luchador. So martial law puts his hands together and bows in respect, and King decides to take this as his chance to end this fight as fast as he can, and he runs directly towards martial law, jumps in the air, extends both his legs out, and both his legs just connect to martial law's face, sending martial law flipping and flying and sliding across the ground, knocking martial law out within one move. And with that, King gets the second round as his victory. Now, whether you agree with that move or not, I think it's a really low blow, but you can understand why he did it, because his own victory and his own profits are not what's at stake here. It's the lives of the kids that he is trying to take care of who do not have a family, and he just used up everything he had in the first fight. And so with that being said, the third round is on the way. The third round is the final round before the championship round, and he goes up against Kazuha. Now, we all know what Kazuha is capable of. This guy is a beast, and King gives it his all. He is throwing massive attacks, very skillful landed blows, and he's, again, combining his strikes with his grapples. However, Kazuha is escaping from those grapples much faster, much easier than Jack was able to, due to him being more nimble than Jack ever was. And so, not only that, but Kazuha is much more trained and much more efficient when it comes to the martial arts style and fighting styles. This guy has been fighting in tournaments since before Tekken 1, and he went up against Paul in the past. And this guy has gone up against incredible fighters. And so he's going up against King very, very well. However, King is not a chump, right? He is giving Kazuha the run for his money. Unfortunately, he's having to nurse his left leg due to the constant punishment that it went through when going up against Jack. And also his muscles again, are strained due to catching that fucking tree and having to pick up that boulder. And so his punches aren't landing with the fierce amount of strength that they would have if he came into this fight fresh. And so Kazuha is just standing his ground and managing to fend off King. However, every time King does manage to get the advantage, it's almost as if Kazuha is pulling energy from nowhere. He's pulling out of his ass and getting stronger and landing blows even more ferociously than in the beginning of the fight. And the reason for that is because, unlike the rest of the fighters, when Kazuha ends up going through strain from the first few battles, Kazuha can tap into that devil gene. He has that devil gene and that devil form to rely on, and the purple aura starts showing. And so it is because of King that Heihachi sees the devil genes starting to show in Kazuha, because King is pushing Kazuha to his very limits. Eventually, Kazuha does overcome King, and I'm gonna have to save the majority of this battle for Kazuha's story, because King is just an amazing opponent against Kazuha. And so with that being said, Kazuha ends up taking the fight, and King ends up losing, taking third place in the tournament, meaning he does not get the cash money he needs to take care of all these kids that don't have families, that need to eat, that need a place to live. King ends up going home with this failure, and when he returns to the orphanage, he finds out that in his absence, an orphan passed away due to sickness, because there was nobody there to care for him except for his fellow orphans. And that is when King just breaks down. He goes into a depression. He hands away the orphanage to more capable hands, and he goes and starts living a life where he is dedicated to alcohol and bars, and he goes missing for a very long time. King spends the duration between Tekken 1 and Tekken 2 drowning his sorrows with the bottle, and just trying to handle the fact that he failed so many children, and that he failed the only life goal that he's ever had. And so now he has been missing for quite some time, and Armored King is getting worried about his once greatest rival, because he hasn't been in wrestling matches ever since his loss at the first tournament. He's been missing. And so he finally finds King stumbling through an alley, and he throws down the Jaguar mask and tells him that there's a second Iron Fist tournament and that he can regain everything that he once lost. And so King does decide that it is time to do it again, and Armored King helps him through these hard times, getting him trained back up, because he hasn't trained this whole time. He's become just a raging alcoholic. And so now King has a very short amount of time to train, and he gets as trained as he can, and he gets his body somewhat back, but his body's nowhere near as fit or as in shape as it was in the first tournament. And so he then enters the second tournament. He's accepted into the second tournament, and he enters the second tournament far weaker than he was in the original game. So again, Tekken 2 is held in an island, mostly forest area with a volcano in the middle. Now, King's first opponent is Lee, Heihachi's second son. Now, Lee is a pretty toned man, and he's pretty skilled in a certain martial art. However, most of Lee's story and most of Lee's character arc development is outside of the tournament, because, as we're about to see, he's just not on the same level at all as the rest of these guys. His skill and his passion is not in fighting. He's mostly doing it to win the approval of his father. King has much more at stake than getting approval from Daddy. King is needing to get his orphanage back. He is wanting to make sure he can take care of more kids, and he's having to redeem himself of his past failures. Sorry if you heard my phone going off there. So he's needing to redeem himself for his past failures. And so with the first match starting, Lee just charges right into battle and throws probably the fastest kicks that you'll ever see thrown, and they all connect with King because he doesn't have time to react. However, he realizes that those kicks didn't even do anything. I mean, they hurt a little bit, but not much. And then Lee starts throwing these elbows and these punches. Again, they're all connecting, but they're not doing anything. And that's when King realizes that someone has been accepted who shouldn't have been accepted. And that's when King realizes that this guy is not on the same level as the rest of the Tekken roster. And so he just backhands Lee, and Lee goes flying across the land, and he's out for the count. It was a very easy win for King. And King's thinking to himself, like, you know, if this is the level of the new contenders, then I'm going to be just fine. I'm not worried about this at all. And so he goes on to the second match with renewed vigor and high hopes. In the second match, he goes up against Paul Phoenix. Now, Paul Phoenix is an incredible fighter, and he's nobody to be reckoned with. Now, when this match begins, I did cover it in Paul's storyline. However, I want to cover it again from the perspective of King. So, Paul is landing these massive blows that can shake the very foundation of the land that these two are standing on. And it is causing not quite as much as Jack did, but it is causing sonic booms to be released from the fists every time they connect. And King is being forced to defend himself very, very intensely in order not to get knocked out by these hits. And King does revert back to his combination of striking and attacking while grappling. However, they're not as effective as they once were because he's no longer as strong as he once was. And he's an incredible, weaker version of what he once was. And so he's having to dance around Paul and try to land these blows against Paul, and these blows are shaking Paul, and Paul's blows are shaking King, and they end up getting involved in this hit-for-hit type game, where every time Paul hits King, it does far more damage to King than it ever did to Paul, but King just returns that punch right afterwards, and using as much energy and force that he can to shake Paul as well, giving the illusion that he's equal. And Paul buys into this illusion. And after a while, King finally ends up managing to get a grapple on this guy. And he starts going from one grapple to another, to another, to another, to another, slamming Paul repeatedly into the ground in various different types of forms. And this is a very iconic moveset for King, going from one grapple to another. And it's very exciting when you pull it off. But anyway, so as King is just going from one grapple to another, just slamming Paul to the ground, he finally incapacitates Paul and knocks Paul out, and he gets to go to the third round. However, this is a completely different scenario for King because he had to use so much energy on Paul, but he didn't get weakened by Paul. He is not in the same state he was in the first tournament where he gave everything he had in the first two fights. He's actually okay now. He's in a good standing position, and he goes up against the former king of the Iron Fist, Heihachi Mishima. Shit. You know this isn't gonna go well for King, and King knows it too. However, so King gets in this defensive stance. He's ready for this Titan to rock him down. And Heihachi does not move for reasons I'm not going to get into in this video. And if you haven't seen my Heihachi storyline, definitely go check it out. However, King is just standing off and seeing this guy open his body up. And he tells King, like, come on, bring it on. Fucking give me the best you got. Give me everything you have. And King takes this, just like he took the opportunity with Law. He's like, an easy win. I'm going to take any easy win I can get. So he runs up and delivers a massive chamber kick to Heihachi's chest. And it doesn't even make Heihachi budge. Heihachi doesn't even move. And this intimidates King. And Heihachi uses his hands to signal more. And so King decides to give him more. He's going to take this opportunity for an easy win because it's not his pride. It's not his ego. And that's not what's at stake right now, right? And so he decides to just deliver this massive onslaught of punches and these blows are massive, and he's throwing everything he has on Heihachi, and 5 minutes pass and he's still throwing blows, and he feels his body giving out, and he's been doing nothing but for the last 5 minutes throwing punch after punch after punch, putting everything he has into these punches, and this man isn't moving. Like, how strong can anybody become? How is this even possible that a man is just taking his punches as if they are nothing? And he's continuing these massive blows, and another 5 minutes pass, and his punches aren't having any effect. He can feel his body not delivering punches, and he's taking everything he has to deliver a punch now. And so now he decides to put Heihachi into a grapple, a neck hold, and he's squeezing as hard as he can in this chokehold, trying to choke out the former king of the Iron Fist. And this goes on for 4 minutes of King just putting everything he has, and finally he can't do it anymore, and his arms start to weaken, and King just pulls his head out and stands up. And this is when King looks at Heihachi, thinking one punch is all it takes. The fight hasn't even begun, and when it does, King wouldn't stand a chance. And knowing that his former self would have been able to at least stand a chance against Heihachi, realizing that who he is now, the body he has now, just doesn't stand a chance against the former champion of the Iron Fist. And it's because of his drinking, it's because of his depression, it's because of him handling his emotions the wrong way that he cannot achieve his dream. He is the reason why he cannot accomplish his dream. He is the reason why he will not be able to take care of any kids or orphans, and he falls to his knees in defeat. And this is when everyone takes it as King's loss, and King walks away as a failure from the second tournament. However, King is revigored. He realizes that the Iron Fist tournament is just at a whole new level of fighters, but he can still be the champion luchador in professional wrestling. And so he goes back into wrestling, and he manages to make enough money by going on to talk shows and just putting himself forth and trying to accumulate enough money to take back his orphanage. And throughout the years, he drops off gifts for all the orphans, and the orphans get to see him. Though he has never been able to buy back an orphanage, he comes and visits that orphanage constantly. And there's the eldest orphan ends up being trained by King, and King trains him in the style and fighting style of being a luchador in professional wrestling, and is helping this oldest orphan achieve his dream, because he has the same dream that King had. And so now, every year and every month, he brings Christmas gifts, and he brings Thanksgiving dinners, and he does what he can with the money that he makes, and he is training this oldest orphan. Well, one day, this is about 15 years later after the Tekken 2 events, one day, this green creature, this green man, is walking towards the orphanage and has his sights on the oldest orphan while King is dropping off food. And King sees it, and this guy is giving off a very intimidating, very dangerous aura. And so he sends all the kids into the orphanage, including the oldest orphan. And the oldest orphan is watching through the window as King is telling this green man, this threat, to leave. He just keeps walking towards King, and this green man won't stop, and this green man is no other than the ogre. And so as King gets closer to Ogre and telling him to leave, the ogre won't stop. And so that is when King decides to tell him that he is intruding on private property, and if he does not leave, King will be forced to use force, right? And will have to remove him by force. And the ogre just starts engaging in battle with King, and he starts punching King and kicking King and sending knees to the gut of King and delivering elbows to the face of King. And King tries to fight back, King tries to defend, but he cannot. He is overwhelmed by this power. And as King gets beat to a bloody pulp, the oldest orphan and the rest of the orphans are watching their hero get beat to the ground. And King refuses to stay down. Every time King is beaten down, Ogre begins to walk towards the orphanage, and King stands back up and gets back in the way and receives even more punishment and gets beaten to a bloody pulp over and over and over and over and over again. Even though he stands no chance of winning, he refuses to allow the ogre to get into this orphanage. And that's when he uses his hand and knocks down a very, very large shed that is right in front of the orphanage. And he manages to tear it down off of its foundations and blocking the door into the orphanage. And as he did that, he used his final amount of strength, and that is when Ogre grabs King by the throat. And with all the orphans watching through the window, Ogre snaps the neck of King, dropping a lifeless, dead body in front of the orphanage. And the ogre then walks off as if nothing happened. Now, the oldest orphan sees this and manages to get out of the orphanage through the window and go over the rubble of the torn down shed and gets to King. And sure enough, King is dead. And he has been murdered by an unknown man. And the oldest orphan is filled with pain, for this is the only father figure that he has ever had, and is the only man that actually would come and visit all these kids, and was the only reason they would receive gifts every Christmas and receive these fantastic meals every Thanksgiving. And he now lays there in a lifeless corpse. And so the oldest orphan takes the jaguar mask and decides to don the name of King. And he trains and trains and trains, and 4 years later, he decides to enter the third Iron Fist tournament with the name of King, in hopes that the ogre will also be there so that he can have revenge on his father figure's murderer. And that is the story of the first king, and that is all I have to say for today. If you guys made it this far, and if you enjoyed, please do consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and maybe even share. It helps me out a lot. I'm a small channel. So yeah, do not get hit by a meteor. Take care of yourselves, and bye.